Jon Bostock is the CEO of Kodak Alaris, the private equity-backed business built from the legacy Kodak platform. He spent 11 years at GC in leadership roles across plastics, water, appliances, before finishing his GE tenure in consumer ventures. Jon has served as COO of Big Ass Fans and CEO of Leaf Home. But before any of that, he was a kid in a small town with no framework for business at all, raised by 3 women in her late 60s and early 70s who paid him a nickel for every drawing he made. All right, Jon. Well, first of all, thank you. I really appreciate you coming to join me today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I know a little bit of your story, just enough to be dangerous. But before we get started, can you share a little bit about your background, how you grew up?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, we've met in the context of me being the CEO of a private equity backed business. But I can tell you, when I was growing up, I knew nothing about business. And I tell a lot of people when I look at my kids and see the way that they were raised, I'm always amazed because they're exposed to so many different things. They see the world in a completely different lens. I was raised in a really small town, had no line of sight to business, and could have never imagined that I'd be doing what I do today. And I think in some ways that gives me a pretty significant competitive advantage. At the other side of it, I always feel like I've got something to prove. And so I think a lot of my success and a lot of the things that I've done have been formed by how I was raised.
Yeah. So just to build upon that, when you think about how you grew up, was there anything that it taught you or you sort of absorbed about risk or security and constraint? And if so, how do they inform your decision making today?
Well, absolutely. And I think people who get to know me see a side that pushes creativity, pushes thinking in new ways. And if you go back to when I was growing up, for the first part of my life, my mom was a single mom. She went back to work, was in school when I was young. And for the most part, we were raised by 3 women who were very influential on me. And these women, it's crazy because at the time, I just looked at them as family. Now, the reality is, they were not blood related, but in every other aspect, these 3 women were family. And they were half Black, half Native American, and just had a completely different perspective on the way the world worked. And they pushed me to be creative. In fact, when I was really young, I used to love going to arcades, and they would give me a nickel for every drawing that I did.
Uh-huh.
And that was my first taste of creating something and then getting something for it, and then being able to go out and do something I wanted to do. And the environment was so creative. When I would draw these pictures, the house would be completely filled. It was like a kid's dream to live in this environment. And it was just an amazing way to be raised. And so fast forward to now, I look at everything as opportunity. And that base of creativity, the base of kind of getting that reward, that little hit for creating something that was new and different, it's lived with me to this day. And I'm super appreciative of being raised just in an environment that was so different than, again, how my kids are raised, which I think is great. It's just more traditional. And so it definitely taught me to push creativity, think about new ways. And they always reminded me that I could truly do anything I wanted to do. And they fundamentally believed it. They had experienced hardships that they knew I would not experience because of the color of their skin, their gender, the time that they grew up. And they just instilled in me this idea that I could be anything and do anything. So that was a huge, huge platform.
That's incredible. I mean, I think I'm imagining I know the answer to this based on how you answer, but it sounds like risk was something that was kind of shaped it. Not that it wasn't dangerous, but like, why wouldn't you see what would happen as opposed to we better be careful about this. There could be a lot of potential downside. Or am I reading that wrong?
No, I think that's right. And it's, I think, I think the more creative outlets that you're exposed to and the more adversity that you're exposed to and the different cultures that you're exposed to help shape who you become. And again, I see that as opportunity. I think the more inclusive we are, the more we're able to think about how we can solve things in new ways. Because I think a lot of things are solved. I mean, think about risk. Risk is effectively not wanting to take the leap in some direction. But I think when we're more open to things, we're more willing to consider whether it's a go-to-market strategy, hiring an employee, organizational structure. We're more willing to do things that may not be considered to be as safe, or they may not be considered to be as obvious. But when you go out and say, look, I'm going to look at the world in a different way, I'm going to push a different agenda here, and I'm going to take on a little bit more risk. It's measured, but I think it allows you to see the world in a different way.
I'm gonna go a little on a little tangent. Was Did you realize when you were young that you wanted to do something in business, or was that something that kind of evolved?
I had no idea what business was, and I don't know how to I really don't know how to say it any other way. I had no framework for it. These 3 women, again, they were my world, but what's insane to think about is they were in their late 60s and 70s when they were raising me.
Mhm.
And that is insane because I didn't think of them in that way.
Right.
I thought of them as just being humans who were taking care of me. I bring that up because they were at the other side of their career and they didn't have a traditional career.
Mhm.
I look at my mom. My mom was in school when I was young. She was a nurse. Again, I didn't really understand exactly what that meant. I didn't have a role model who would say, here's how you can make money. Here are the things you can do to learn and grow. I didn't have that. And so I kind of figured it out as I went along. I was lucky in that when I went to college, I got exposed to more things, but by no means did I think, okay, I'm going to get into business and I'm going to run businesses for private equity firms. I just had no idea what that
Right.
was.
So when you think about that, kind of how you were coming up and the things you were absorbing and you were learning about, whether you recognize they were going to apply to you later, was there anything you sort of internalized then that that felt later felt incomplete? Like you adopted it early in life. You said this is going to be a good strategy, and then as you face different circumstances in business or life, where you said maybe we need to pivot.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that I was raised in an inclusive environment. When I first started my career, I'll admit I wasn't as inclusive
Mhm.
as I am now, and that shifted over time. And I think as I look back, it was that I grew up in that environment. I respected that environment. I enjoyed that environment early in my career when I was at GE. I think I moved to a little bit more control, a little bit more force, a little bit more rigidity in terms of how we think about things. And I think inclusiveness was something that early on in my career, every time I sat down with a GE leader in my performance review, they said, "Look, this is an area of development." And so, even though I was
On
raised
the
in
on the
that
kind of the
way.
rigidity.
That's right. Even though I was raised in that way, I kind of oversteered to thinking that maybe that's the leadership style. And look, you look back, maybe it was a lack of confidence and thinking you had to operate in a different way than you're raised and what your instinct
Right.
is. But now I think I'm more comfortable in terms of who I am, how I think about things, and for sure I have pivoted from that. And I'd say that I am much more inclusive now, much more willing to look at the customer base in a different way, the supplier base in a different way. I think I always say this that you couldn't be where you are had you not been through what you had been through. Every step is a building block. And so I absolutely look back and that's one big one, but there are always those moments where you say, look, I got to improve here. I'm going to pivot and do it differently. The inclusiveness thing is a big one because it's just completely different from who I am today.
I'm actually surprised to hear you say that that's what came up in your performance reviews because you've written a lot about your experience at GE and kind of evolution through your career and the elephant's dilemma. And one of the things that you share about in there is how you rethought about what the microwave could be, something that could produce healthy products. So I kind of went away with like, this guy was always thinking in these novel ways. But it sounds like that was something that you had to develop.
Yeah, and I think that there's a difference in thinking in a novel way and bringing people along the
Mm,
journey. And
yeah.
I think that's a huge difference. And I think that it's a nuance. You're right in that if I look back at my GE career, I did push things. I did try to be creative. I did try to think in a way that was outside of the standard. But with that said, if you look at teamwork, if you look at pulling people along, I'd say I'm a much better leader today than I was back then. And I
Agreed.
think that, we always have to hold ourselves accountable to what we do well and what we don't do well. And yeah, I'd say if I could reinvent a category today, and look, we've done a lot of great work in the current role that I'm in, a lot that could not have been achieved without getting the entire team aligned. Whereas you look back at GE and a lot of the things you could be more singular and get away with it. You just can't do that now. The market moves too fast. Businesses are more complex. Competitors come out of nowhere. And so I think you have to lead in a much different way than even 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, I agree. And in what I do, and maybe this is changing, but I think that there's a perception that leaders have certain qualities that make that they're comprised of, and if they have these different qualities, you can kind of plug them in GE, you can plug them in Kodak Alaris, you can plug them anywhere, and they'll figure it out and they'll do well. And I have a little different belief that some of this is situational, and it really depends on the context in terms of which qualities. So as you think about your own career, I'm imagining GE is very different animal than where you are today. Um, were there certain things about how the context have changed that have influenced how you have to show up to lead? Like maybe qualities today that in order to be successful in terms of driving business at Kodak Alaris, you've got to have, but it would have been okay if you didn't have it at GE and you would have been very effective.
You know, it's an amazing question, and I wish we almost had 5 hours to talk about it because I'd answer it in a slightly different way, which is I totally agree with your concept that things are situational. If you look at GE versus Kodak Alaris, I'd argue that structurally, they're very similar in some ways. And when you think about those ways, GE was always very process oriented. When you brought a product to market, there was a new product introduction cycle and there were payback models and there was a rhythm to it that ultimately led into biannual, annual reviews and an operating cadence that rolled up all the way to GE corporate. That existed at Kodak Alaris when I got there. I'd say the difference in the situational awareness is in some cases, like a GE, that process control was very important. GE was a very large organization. It had a lot of dots that needed to be connected. Kodak Alaris, obviously part of the legacy Kodak business, now private equity owned, so completely separate, but much smaller. It still had those same processes, but we had to remove them and we had to inspire people to just think in a completely different way. And so I agree in that situational leadership matters, but also awareness of what works in the moment and adjusting to that. So, in other words, you don't want people just to work in isolation and by themselves without process,
Mhm.
because theoretically, process brings people together. You have to coach them and train them in a different way, inspire them to think in a different way, inspire them to believe in things like working together, being inclusive, but not having those forced processes. So I completely agree with you that situations matter, situational leadership matters, but I think a lot of the characteristics carry through,
Mm.
and I think a lot of the same realities exist, which is ultimately every single business sells to a customer. Now, maybe it's a consumer, maybe it's a business, but in the end, we're just thinking about the easiest way to get from point A to B. That's what every single business does. And so I think it's understanding how effectively to look at a team, at a culture and adapt based on the framework that exists. And so, but again, I think you and I could talk about this a lot. I think
Yeah.
I firmly believe in the context of business. I firmly believe in the situation, and you have to adapt.
So you, a moment ago, you had mentioned the feedback you were getting in those early performance reviews is, "Hey, John, you know, great ideas, but you kind of need to bring other people along, and you need to do it in a way that's inclusive and invites them." So when you come into Kodak Alaris, you inherit, I would imagine, a team and a lot of employees that have been with a long established company with probably pretty entrenched ways of doing things and thinking about the business. Um, and I'm sure you made some changes there, but also there's probably a lot of people that are still there. So how did that learning and development you got early in your career in coaching translate into bringing those folks along, probably to make some changes in how they thought about the business and how they approached it and in PE speed, you know, which may have been different than the speed they were operating at before.
Yeah, and look, I'm incredibly thankful to the the process of GE, and I was very fortunate to go through an executive leadership program there and to be at the company for over a decade. So look, the foundational training is phenomenal, and I think GE is one of the best at preparing people for future roles. I think to your question, when I came into Kodak Alaris, I was very lucky in that I came in at the beginning point of the Kingswood Capital investment. So I had the advantage of being shoulder to shoulder with a private equity firm that had just invested in this platform and removed it from sitting in the protection fund, which was a post bankruptcy vehicle to effectively solve for the larger Kodak bankruptcy. And so when I first started, one of the very first things I did was spend a whole lot of time listening. So I traveled to all the locations throughout the world to really understand what was on the minds of different people. We held a lot of town halls and I listened quite a bit. And what you ultimately heard was that groups that were closer to the customer, so our teams in Europe, our teams in the Middle East, our teams in Asia, they experienced friction with corporate. This idea of a corporate team that would act as a governing body and would inevitably slow things down, whether it be around pricing, marketing strategy, et cetera. So we listened to that. And then we came back within the first few months and developed a plan to have the company move faster, to be much more agile. From day one, I said we're going to set out on a plan to figure out how to make the company work in a faster way, to be more agile, to work together, but we're going to do it in a different way. Establishing that baseline and listening to people allowed us to make rapid change. We took a significant amount of cost out and we took roles out, but we focused on roles that created layers of bureaucracy, layers that slowed the business down, and ultimately put the business in the hands of people that were close to the customer. And that sped things up. That meant processes went away. That meant we ultimately had to deliver in a much more efficient way. But what it did was it gave people the belief that it was new and different. Then, once we did the changes, we communicated why we did it and what the realities were. Now, here we are over a year later, we've gone back out and done town halls and talked about those proof points. And so the key leadership lesson here is while, look, not everyone was in the room when we're making the final decision on
Sure.
how to structure the business, how to eliminate what we considered to be bureaucratic processes. That was done with a very small group, but we had the proof points of listening and we had the credibility to say we went out, we listened, we solved for it. We went out multiple times to provide that context and clarity to it. And we were highly consistent. And when you think about what the brain needs that. And
Right.
so ultimately, I look at it and say the lesson was in GE, what GE trained me was you got to bring people along. It doesn't mean they have to be a part of every single decision, but they have to understand the context up front. I think you look at now, I think we nailed it. We got it right. Morale is higher than it's been in a long time, even though we made some very difficult changes. And so I think those are examples of the building blocks because it doesn't mean that you're told early in your career that you're not inclusive. Later in your career, you got to do management by committee. It's just not the
Right.
reality of it. But what it does mean is you have to listen.
So, are there actions that you undertook in your current role at Kodak Alaris that you did them in part because you might not have done them in prior roles, and you realize, this would have gone much better if I did ABC.
Um, I think every gray hair you get, you gain, and I have a lot. You become more confident in the decisions you make. And when I made the comment that you couldn't do what you're doing today had it not been for the building blocks that you've established, when you see patterns and you see things, it's able to help you in ways that you had never imagined. And I would say earlier on in my career, I probably wouldn't have had the confidence to make some of the decisions. As an example, when I looked at this business and said we had to be closer to the customer, I allowed price to be determined at the market level.
Mhm.
Earlier in my career, I probably would have said price need to be consolidated at the corporate level, studied, analyzed, etc. When you look at the reality of a business that operates in most major markets throughout the world, you simply can't wait for a team in Rochester, New York to come back and tell you what the price should be. And so it's a very minor example, but I think it speaks to a broader lesson, and you got to empower your teams, and you have to have faith that they're going to deliver. And really, as I've gotten to this point in my career, I've realized either you've got people in the roles that can do the work
Mhm.
or they can't. And you shouldn't have to put a governing body over someone. Either they can do it, they can't. The governing body doesn't solve the fact that either they're the right one or the wrong one for the role.
Right, sure. Uh, yeah, so I've another question because you spend a lot of time you spend probably time assessing more businesses than you get involved with, right? So when you're
That's
assessing a
right.
business from the outside, are there some early signs that you pick up on that this is a great idea, but this strategy is gonna fail once it hits execution?
Yeah, it's interesting. Now, with that said, most of the businesses I look at are private equity, so they do have some traction. I
Mhm,
do not spend a lot of time on the venture side, which is more early stage. But what I would say is, I think from a contextual standpoint, and I raised that
mhm.
before, there seems to be a lack of understanding about what has made businesses successful and what will make businesses successful in the future. And so there's always the saying that past performance doesn't equal future results. And the reality is that's true in a lot of businesses. And where there's a lot of false reads is really understanding what the competitive moat was for the business in the past and what the competitive moat can be in the future. That's number one, is just true lack of understanding of what makes this business defensible. And is it sustainable? That's number one. Number two, I think there are cultural issues. And in a lot of private equity backed businesses, you have founder transitions. So going from the founder of the organization to a professionalized organization, that creates a lot of friction. You also have cultural issues where you have people who fundamentally believe in the first point I made, which
Mhm.
is what the competitive mode is, even if that competitive mode is not real, but that culture believes it to be real. And so those are some areas that are pretty challenging. And I think that ultimately when you look at an organization, the easiest ones, in my opinion, are the ones that need massive transformation because there's an acknowledgement and willingness to make the changes that need to be changed. When you do things halfway,
Right.
it creates a tremendous amount of friction in the business.
Is there something kind of as a continuation of that? Is there something that you think leaders most often misread about the context that they're stepping into, that later shows up in execution?
Yeah, I think I would say 99% of leaders misread the time variable.
Mm,
And what I mean by that is time matters the most in everything we do. I fundamentally believe the largest companies in the world haven't started yet that will be around in 10 years. So, said another way, 10 years from now, the biggest companies haven't started, right? That is a headline. What that means is speed matters no matter what you do. And I think a lot of people walk into roles and take too much time to figure out what end is up, where things need to change, what the real competitive moat is in the business. And that ultimately kills businesses. It has to start on day one. And I think that when you look at a business and you make assumptions that you have time, inevitably you'll fail. And the challenge with time is you got to be able to assess it, and you got to be able to get the board aligned. If obviously it's a private equity backed business, you got to get the sponsor aligned, but you ultimately have to assess, create a plan to make changes, execute those changes, and then obviously show how those changes impact the business. But time is something that not a lot of people understand well, and they do not understand the massive, massive challenges of waiting too long.
If you had told me a quarter century ago that the biggest companies in 10 years, 10 years from now wouldn't exist today, I would have thought you were just, sort of a melodramatic kind of uh, CEO type of guy. But I distinctly remember doing venture capital work, prior career as a lawyer in Palo Alto, 2001, using Yahoo for stuff to look up things, and someone coming in my office and was like, "Oh, like I like to use this new search engine called Google. It's just it's really stripped down, but it's pretty good." And thinking about that's all we thought it was then was this little search engine that didn't have that much else on the screen, and now it's kind of everything. So um, I can certainly I can swallow a little bit that the Google of 2035 may not be here today. So um,
Well, and look, I feel lucky in that I started my career, as much as I say that GE was a great training ground, GE made some mistakes. GE is not what it was back when I started. I also am lucky in that I'm part of the Kodak legacy now. And so by being the CEO of Kodak Alaris, I get a in-house view of what went wrong. And look, Kodak was a top business in its time. And so Kodak was an Apple of its time, right? And so I do feel lucky that I've been in businesses that weren't the Googles, that weren't the Apples, that weren't the Anthropics of the world. And I've seen it, how quickly these businesses have come in, how fast they've disrupted the market. And it should remind us all that it can be done, and no business is entitled to grow and win every single day. And by the way, that is a very, very true statement that people do not believe at their core. They do not look at that competitive moat and say it's real or it's not real.
right.
Everyone in the room will say, we agree. Every business is not entitled to grow. We're not entitled to win. Everyone will nod their head. The reality is that they walk out of the rooms and they kind of believe that they are entitled to it, and no one will disrupt them. And they're not worried about it. I think over and over and over again, it gets proven that businesses come out of nowhere. Competitors who are not your competitors become your competitors. Disruptors who come in challenge the system. And so you just got to be prepared for it. You got to remind the company that you have to think in a different way.
I mean, one of the things about the Kodak too, because you mentioned that both GE and Kodak are these huge brands, and especially I'm kind of a Gen Xer, especially if you go up at a certain time. I mean, they're huge. So, are are there ways that having, even though you're trying to do radically different things with the business and it's a different time, are there doors that open and advantages that happen having that Kodak name, and maybe limitations that happen that are a drag for when you're trying to do something different?
But in many ways, it's around missed opportunity, and
Okay.
it's around the assumption that categories are lost and they can't be reinvented. I was sitting in a meeting talking about a specific category that I wish I could share the case study of because it's fascinating. And we were talking about this category. It's a category that we're not in today. It's for our Kodak Moments business that ultimately enables photo solutions at retail all over the world, 50,000 locations. And I was in a meeting, actually in a town hall, talking about how several teammates were working on this idea to disrupt the vertical because that vertical was archaic and it was broken. Someone raised their hand and said, Kodak develop the IP to solve this. We have the IP to solve it. Now, that was an example, by the way, of someone who knew that, someone who had great knowledge of the IP portfolio, had great knowledge of things that had worked on in the past. It's one of the huge advantages of this business is you've got people who were around back when Kodak was huge and successful. But here in today's world with new technology stacks, things that enable you to look at business models in different ways, learning language models that allow you to tweak business models and be really creative and disruptive with it, all of a sudden that IP takes on a completely different new form. Again, had it not been for this ad hoc conversation, no one would have ever known. So I think there are certainly some interesting things that when you look at larger businesses, you realize there's a tremendous amount of value. The key, and look, I haven't figured this out, but the key is doing an inventory of everything that made that company great and figuring out how to look at it in a new lens.
I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, it's just it's really interesting the diversity of the organizations that you've been a part of and play leadership roles and um in terms of the legacy that they establish, but it seems like they're always bringing you in when they're trying to go in some radically different direction or capitalize on where they've been before. So I'm curious when you're evaluating leaders yourself for the businesses you're in, is there something that separates those who you think can operate across different environments versus those who have maybe qualities or capabilities that are very situation specific?
Yeah, I think the best leaders I've worked with, and it's interesting, we've talked a lot about inclusiveness, and when you and I have talked in the past, we've talked about empathy and things like that. To be clear, leaders have to be quantitative. And it's very, very important because even when you think about things like I described, which is going out, learning, then making
Mm,
changes, we quantified those changes and shared the results. And people really understand when change equals positivity based on data, it matters. And I think being aligned around the numbers matters, number one. Number two, I think leaders need to be nice people. And why I say that is that we're all human beings. Like work is a part of our life, it's not our life. And I think when you show up and you're part of a team, it's not easy and you make really hard decisions, but you can actually be a nice person. And I think the best leaders are very analytical, very focused, but they're nice. And I think that does lead to better performance overall. And by the way, I'm not nice 100% of the time, but I try to be. And I think that is a characteristic. And then third, I'd say what I've observed is leaders who believe that things can be done. And that is a mentality that you can look at problems and say it can't be done, or you can look at problems and say it can be done and I'll figure it out. And I think that when you combine those things of being very data driven and quantitative, being a nice human being, and saying that you can always get something done, in the end, the results will be fantastic. And I think the reality is we see a lot of people who look at data and they kind of position it to promote themselves. They're nice maybe 40% of the time. I'd lobby for maybe 95% of the time.
mhm,
And a lot of them take the position that something can't be done because they believe it gives them power and a platform to kind of either play Monday morning quarterback or just talk about why things can't happen. The real magic comes when people talk about why something can happen. I mean that when you force people to solve problems, it's exceptional what the outcome
yeah,
is. So leaders that have those three characteristics are fantastic.
good. J Taking this all down, this is what I do for a living, right? Evaluating people on this basis. So, I wanna finish as one question for you, and I'm gonna make it so you can apply it to at first, I was gonna ask it specifically around Kodak Alaris, but it can really be any of your roles. If you Is there one of your roles that if you think picked a phenomenal leader, but if you plopped him in that role at day 1 of whenever day 1 was you went in that role, that they'd get this wrong in the first 90 days. And it wasn't because they weren't a great leader or any capabilities. It was just something that was uniquely specific about that context that you kind of had to get in there and bump your head against it before you'd realize what the situation was.
Yeah, I'd say early on in my career, I went in and worked with a founder to restructure the business and ultimately sell it to private equity. And now during that time, there was a lot of change in the organization. I think it's a great example of that founder's leadership style worked for the first 2 decades of that company. That founder's leadership style may or may not have worked for the next 20. But if you take that same personality style and put them in the situation I'm in today, it absolutely would not have worked.
And why do you say
And
that?
so I think when you look at founders, and this is pretty consistent with the founders I've met and the businesses I've evaluated, most founders unilaterally operate the company. Most decisions are made unilaterally through the founder. Almost everything is run through the founder, literally. Almost every single decision. I've seen founders who read copy of advertisements and opine on that, get into the details at every single level. And I can tell you, running a business that's global with 3 different business units, you do not have time to look at every single detail. You do not have time to criticize people on emails that are going out to customers or press releases, et cetera. You have to put people in place that can execute and have systems in place that they're executing.
Mhm.
And so I'm not, by the way, saying you need bureaucratic processes, because I already
Sure.
explained I don't believe in that. But that's an example of typical founders. That mentality does not work in a large organization. Simply does not work. And I think as businesses get larger, as businesses get more complex, you need the leadership style to translate downstream.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of founders struggle with it. Now, look, there are a lot of founders who have done really well, a lot of them in tech, and we read about them every single day. But I'm talking about mid-market private equity, where a lot of business gets done. It's a lot of labor-intensive essential services, things like that, where you need leadership to really come and play. It's a good example that that works in that time and that framework, but it would not work in today's world, in this environment.
So I didn't intend to mislead you, but I did. So because of something you said, I mean, just one more little question to follow up on that. How do you determine these are the things that I need to have visibility and weigh in on, and these are the things that I need to empower others because we can never run this business if I'm looking at it.
Try to simplify things in such a deep way, and I look at it and say, I want to know if we're delivering for the customer, and if we're doing things that obviously create value for them.
Mhm.
And I want to see those metrics. And what I've learned is, ultimately, when the customer feels good about what's going on, when there's great momentum, sales will increase. And so I look at things like sales funnels, I look at things like sales metrics, I look at a lot of the front end things, because ultimately that is what drives the business forward. And so, um, I tend to look at the customer and the health of the customer and determine whether things are right or wrong based on that.
Okay. Well, I appreciate it, John. And thank you so much. I've enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate you taking out time to have it.
Likewise.
Um, I've got a little homework assignment. I'm gonna give you 2 years to do it. I want a second book. We're living in a very different world today. So I want the Elephant's Dilemma Part 2. Okay.
I'll try to get it done.
Okay. I appreciate it, John. You have a great one. Okay. Thanks again.
Thank you.